Welcome to Myths and Slumber. Tonight, we explore the epic struggle between Horus, the falcon god of sky and light, and Set, the god of chaos and storms, two divine forces locked in a timeless battle for Egypt's sacred throne. If ancient myths are your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let the ancient stories carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. Close your eyes. Let the weight of the day begin to soften. Let your body grow heavy and warm, sinking gently into the surface beneath you. Feel each breath moving slowly in through your nose, filling your chest, and releasing through your lips like a long, quiet sigh. There is nothing you need to hold on to tonight. Nothing you need to solve or remember or carry forward. The world beyond this moment is very far away, and growing farther still with every breath you take. Tonight, we travel somewhere ancient. Somewhere so old that the stars themselves were different when these stories were first told. We are going to the land of the black earth and the golden desert, to the banks of a great river that has never stopped flowing, to a kingdom that existed before memory, before writing, before the very concept of time had fully formed in the minds of those who first lived beneath its endless blue sky. We are going to Egypt. Not the Egypt of tourists and photographs, but the Egypt of the soul, the inner landscape of a civilization that looked at the sky and saw their gods walking there. A people who believed that the sun rose each morning because a god carried it in his golden boat, and that the stars were the souls of those who had passed into the eternal fields beyond the western horizon. Breathe in. And breathe out. Let the warm sand gather beneath your feet. Let the scent of lotus blossoms and river water and warm stone settle over you like a blanket woven from ancient dreams. The story that awaits you tonight is one of the oldest stories ever told by human lips. It is a story of love and betrayal, of death and resurrection, of a father's legacy and a son's long journey to claim it. It is the story of Horus and Set, two gods, two brothers, two forces as old as the cosmos itself, and the great contest between them that would determine the fate of all Egypt, and all the world. Let it begin. Part 1, The World Before the Storm, Creation, the Ennead, and the Family of the Gods. Before there was Egypt, there was nothing. Not darkness, exactly. Not silence. Just an infinite, formless expanse of water called none, the primordial deep, the chaos that existed before the first breath, the vast and featureless ocean of potential that contained everything that would ever be, compressed into a state of absolute stillness. And within that stillness, there was something. A single point of awareness. A consciousness so ancient that it had no name yet, because there was no language yet, because there was no mind yet to speak it. The Egyptians would come to call this being Adam, the complete one, the self-created, and they believed that he had always existed, floating in the deep waters of none, dreaming of himself into being. Adam stirred. In some tellings, he spoke his own name into the void, and the sound of it created the first ripple in the primordial ocean. In others, he emerged upon a mound of earth, the first land, the first solid thing in all existence, that rose up from the waters at the beginning of time. This mound was called the Benben, and it was sacred, and every temple ever built in Egypt was meant to echo its shape, to be a small reminder of that first impossible moment when something appeared where nothing had been before. Adam breathed out. And from his breath, he created two children. The first was Shu, the god of air, the space between earth and sky, the invisible medium through which all living things breathe. She was calm and steady, a force of separation and order, the divine architect of empty space. The second was Tefnut, the goddess of moisture, of rain and dew and the wetness that allows life to grow. She was complementary to her brother, as moisture is inseparable from air, as rain is inseparable from sky. Shu and Tefnut became the parents of two great children of their own. Their son was Geb, the earth itself. Not merely a god who watched over the earth, but the earth in divine form. When the Egyptians felt the ground beneath their feet, they were standing on the body of Geb. When earthquakes rumbled through the desert, it was Geb laughing. He was vast and patient and green, and he was the foundation upon which all living things rested. Their daughter was Nut, the sky. Not merely a goddess who lived in the sky, but the sky itself made divine and feminine. She arched her long, star-covered body over Geb, her twin and her lover, touching the earth only at the tips of her fingers and toes, her belly a curved vault of blue and black and gold. The stars moved across her body each night, and the sun traveled through her from mouth to womb and was reborn each morning. Together, Geb and Nut formed the visible world, the earth below and the heavens above, the container in which all life would unfold. But Nut and Geb were not satisfied with being only the world. They longed for children of their own. And so Nut became pregnant, and the great god Ra, who was the sun, the supreme force of creation, the highest of all the gods, grew troubled. He feared what children of the earth and sky might become. He feared their power, their potential, the ways in which they might upset the order he had worked so hard to establish. And so Ra decreed that Nut could not give birth on any day of the year. This was a terrible thing. A divine curse laid upon a divine mother. Nut walked the heavens with her children growing inside her, unable to release them, unable to bring them into being, the curse of Ra pressing down upon her like a stone. But the gods are nothing if not resourceful. There was, in those ancient days, a god of great wit and cunning and infinite cleverness. His name was Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, of writing, of magic and mathematics and the reckoning of time. Thoth loved Nut, or perhaps he simply loved the challenge of solving impossible problems, which in his case amounted to the same thing. Thoth went to the moon. In those days, the moon was nearly as bright as the sun, and the gods played games of chance with the moon's light. Thoth challenged the moon to a series of games. The Egyptians said it was Senet, the ancient board game of fate, and Thoth, being the cleverest of all beings, won. And what he won was this: a small portion of the moon's light, gathered up over many nights, a tiny sliver here and a sliver there, until he had accumulated enough light to create 5 new days, days that existed outside the official calendar of Ra's year, days that belonged to no season and no decree, days during which the curse of Ra did not apply. These were the 5 epigomenal days, the days outside of time, the days between years, and upon each of them, Nut gave birth to one of her 5 magnificent children. On the first day, Osiris was born. On the second day, Horus the elder was born, the great hawk of the sky, though his story differs from the Horus we will speak of tonight. On the third day, Set was born, and his birth was difficult, violent, tearing. He burst from his mother's side, unable to wait, impatient even at the very moment of his first breath. On the fourth day, Isis was born, the great mother, the perfect goddess, the mistress of magic and words and love. And on the 5th day, Nephthys was born, the lady of the house, the quiet sister, the goddess of the boundary between life and death. These five, Osiris, Horus the Elder, Set, Isis, and Nephthys, together with Shu, Tefnut, Geb, Nut, and Adam himself, formed the Ennead, the great company of 9 gods who would govern the cosmos, whose stories would become the foundation of all Egyptian religion and myth and understanding. But tonight, we are concerned most particularly with 2 of these children. With Osiris and Set. With the Golden King and the Red Destroyer. With the order that existed before the storm, and the storm itself. Osiris was everything a god-king should be. He was tall and magnificent, his skin green as the fertile banks of the Nile, green as the growing grain, green as life itself renewed after the long heat of summer. He wore the double crown of Egypt, the white crown of Upper Egypt nested within the red crown of Lower Egypt, and he carried the crook and flail, the symbols of kingship and judgment. He was wise and gentle and beloved by all who knew him. When Geb, the earth god their father, gave up his throne to step back into his divine role as the ground beneath all feet, it was Osiris who inherited the kingdom. Osiris who became the first great king of Egypt, the shepherd of humanity, the one who taught human beings how to farm the land and bake bread and brew beer and build homes and worship the gods and conduct themselves with dignity and justice. Beside him was his sister and wife, Isis. Isis was perhaps the most powerful of all the gods, not through brute force or raw divine energy, but through wisdom, through cunning, through the perfect application of magic at precisely the right moment. She was called the Great Enchantress, the Mistress of Magic, the one who knows all names. She loved Osiris completely, devotedly, with a love so deep and so absolute that it would survive even death itself, as we shall see. And then there was Set. Set was not evil, not in the way the word is sometimes used. He was something more complicated than that, more interesting than that. He was the lord of the Red Land, the desert, the harsh, barren wilderness beyond the irrigated fields, the place where the sun burned without mercy and nothing grew. He was the god of storms and chaos and the breaking of things. He was wild, unpredictable, immensely powerful, and deeply unsatisfied. Set had his wife, too. Her name was Nephthys, the quiet sister of Isis, the shadow to Isis's light. And Set ruled alongside his brother Osiris, presiding over the wild places while Osiris tended the fertile ones. There was, in those early days, a kind of balance between them. But balance, in mythology as in life, is always temporary. Beneath the surface of Set's formidable life, something darker was growing. A resentment. A hunger. A feeling, perhaps not entirely without foundation, that he had been overlooked, passed over, that the throne which should have come to him had gone instead to his brother, and that the world which loved Osiris so completely had never loved Set at all. This feeling, once it took root, would grow into something monstrous. Something that would shatter the divine order of the cosmos, plunge the world into grief and darkness, and set in motion a story that would not resolve itself for 80 long years. But before the storm, there was a time of peace. A time when the gods ruled in harmony and the Nile flooded each year and the grain grew tall and Egypt was the jewel of the known world. Let us linger there for just a moment longer. Let us breathe in the peace before the storm. Part 2, The Murder of Osiris, Set's Great Betrayal. The conspiracy grew slowly, as all great treacheries do. Set had watched his brother Osiris for years. He had watched the way the people adored him, the way the gods deferred to him, the way Isis looked at him with those ancient and knowing eyes full of something that Set had never been offered by anyone, pure, complete, devoted love. He had watched and watched and watched, and somewhere in the watching, admiration had curdled into envy, and envy had fermented into hatred. The ancient texts tell us that Set gathered around him a company of conspirators, 72 of them, according to some accounts, though others give different numbers. These were gods and demons and shadowy figures from the borderlands of the divine world, beings who had their own grievances, their own reasons for wanting the old order upset and replaced with something new. Among his co-conspirators was also the Queen of Ethiopia in some tellings, a powerful figure who added her own dark ambitions to the growing plot. Together, they made a plan. Not a plan of open warfare, for Set, whatever else he was cunning, but something more subtle, more elegant, more terrible. They would trap Osiris. Set had his conspirators take the precise measurements of Osiris while the great king slept, and from these measurements, they built a chest, a magnificent chest of cedar and ebony and ivory, decorated with precious stones and painted with scenes of glory, beautiful enough to be a work of art, or a sarcophagus, depending on your perspective. And then Set through a great feast. It was a lavish celebration, as Set's entertainments always were. He was, despite everything, a god of enormous appetites and theatrical flair, and when Set decided to celebrate, he celebrated with the full force of his terrifying personality. The gods came. Osiris came. Wine flowed freely and music drifted through the warm night air, and the stars watched from above with their usual silent indifference. At the height of the feast, Set had the chest brought forward. It gleamed in the torchlight, extraordinary, unprecedented, unlike anything anyone had ever seen. The gods laughed and jostled forward, eager. One by one, they climbed into the chest and found it too large, or too small, or too narrow, or too wide. The chest, of course, had been made to exactly one person's dimensions, and that person was sitting quietly at the feast, drinking his wine, watching the game with the mild curiosity of a king who has no reason to suspect any harm. At last, with the inevitability of all fated things, Osiris himself climbed into the chest. He lay down inside it. He fit perfectly. The conspirators moved before anyone could react. 72 hands slammed the lid of the chest closed, and those same hands sealed it, with molten lead, some say, poured around every crack and joint until the chest was airtight, until no breath could enter and no cry could escape. They carried the chest to the Nile, that great and sacred river that was the lifeblood of Egypt, and they threw it in. The chest floated away into the darkness. Osiris, the first and greatest king of Egypt, was dead. What happened next in the divine court was chaos, as you might imagine. Set moved quickly, seizing power before the shock had time to organize itself into resistance. He declared himself king. He took the double crown. He sat upon the throne of Egypt with the brutal confidence of a man who has done a terrible thing and intends to profit from it. Nephthys, his own wife, was horrified. She had always been caught between her loyalty to Set and her love for Isis and Osiris, and this act, this murder, this usurpation, this violation of every divine law, pushed her firmly and finally to the other side. She would spend the long years to come helping her sister, not her husband, and this was a defection that Set would never forgive. Isis, meanwhile, had collapsed into a grief so total, so encompassing, that it threatened to remake the world in its image. Isis was the mistress of magic, the most powerful goddess in the divine assembly, and her grief was not a quiet thing. It was vast. It was seismic. It was the kind of grief that makes the earth tremble and the stars weep and the river run with something other than water. But Isis was also, above all things, a goddess of action. And she would not let her grief become her prison. She cut off a lock of her hair, the gesture of mourning, the ancient and sacred signal to all who watched from the other side, and then she stood up, and she went to find her husband. What followed was one of the great searches of mythology. Isis traveled the length and breadth of Egypt and beyond, asking everywhere she went, asking every person and every creature and every plant and every stone whether they had seen the chest that held the body of her king. She went to the delta, to the cities, to the desert, to the marshes. She questioned children, who often see what adults overlook. She spoke to fish in the river. It was the fish who told her, eventually, that the chest had passed beyond the borders of Egypt altogether. The Nile had carried it northward and out into the Great Sea, and the sea had carried it eastward to the coast of Phoenicia, a land of tall cedars and seafarers, a land quite far from Egypt, a land where no one would have known to look for the body of a god. The chest had come ashore at a place called Byblos, a great trading city, rich and cosmopolitan, well-traveled. And when it came to shore, something miraculous happened, as things do when the divine is involved. A tamarisk tree had grown up around the chest. Not slowly and carefully, the way trees usually grow, but rapidly, overwhelmingly, with the urgency of something enchanted. The tree had swallowed the chest entirely, growing around it, incorporating it into its own woody flesh, until the chest was hidden inside the trunk of the most magnificent tamarisk tree anyone had ever seen. The tree was so beautiful, so vast, so fragrant, so clearly extraordinary, that the king of Byblos, whose name in various tellings is Malkander, ordered it cut down and brought to his palace to be used as a pillar in his great hall. And so the body of Osiris stood at the heart of a foreign king's home, disguised as ordinary timber, waiting. Isis came to Byblos. She came quietly, without fanfare, as a traveler, as a woman alone, sitting near the palace well. She spoke to the queen's servants when they came to draw water, and she braided their hair with her divine fingers, and she breathed upon them, and when they returned to the palace, they carried the scent of Isis on their skin, a scent the queen described as like the breath of gods, like flowers, and sun and something ancient and holy that she could not name. The queen summoned the mysterious stranger. And Isis, in the way of all clever travelers, made herself so useful, so gentle, so clearly gifted, that she was invited to stay and to nurse the queen's young son. But one night, the queen followed a sound she couldn't quite explain, and she saw the strange nurse holding her child over a flame. And she screamed. The magic was broken. The immortality was lost, and the child would remain mortal, because his mother's fear had severed the working before it was complete. Isis dropped the child, unharmed, but unimmortal, and let her divine nature show itself. She was magnificent. Terrible and radiant, the goddess in her fullness, filling the room with a light that was not quite any color ever seen before or since. She asked only one thing, the pillar. The king, who was not foolish, gave it to her. Isis split the tamarisk open with the force of her need, and there inside it, still sealed, still perfect, was the chest that held her husband. She fell upon it and wept, and her weeping was so fierce and so absolute that the young crown prince of Byblos, who had crept close to see what was happening, died of fright on the spot. Isis took the chest and sailed back to Egypt. And that, perhaps, should have been the end of the horror. But it was not. Part 3, The Dismemberment, Set's final act of violence. She hid there because she was afraid. Not for herself, but for what she carried. She knew that Set had spies everywhere, that Set's eyes were always open, that Set's anger was a force of nature as reliable and terrible as the desert wind. She needed time. She needed privacy. She needed to work the greatest magic any god had ever attempted. She needed to bring Osiris back. The Egyptians told this part of the story in many ways, across many centuries, and the versions differ in their details. But the heart of it is this: Isis used her magic to breathe life back into the body of Osiris, temporarily, briefly, just long enough. She transformed herself into a bird, a kite, the ancient scholars say, a hawk-like bird associated with mourning and with the souls of the dead, and she hovered over the body of Osiris, and she beat her wings to create the breath of life, and she spoke the words that only she knew, the secret names of things, the deep language beneath language that could move the world. And Osiris stirred. Not fully. Not completely. Not in the way of the living who have never died. But enough. Enough for Isis, with all the power and love and desperate magic she possessed, to conceive a child. A son. The son who would become, in time, the vehicle of all justice, the avenger of his father, the rightful king of all Egypt. The child's name would be Horus. But before Horus was born, before the world had time to absorb the magnitude of what had just happened in the dark papyrus marshes, Set struck again. There are different accounts of how he found the chest. Some say one of his hunting parties came across it in the delta marshes. Some say a spy reported to him. Some say Set, who was lord of the dark and empty places, simply sensed that something had been restored that he had unmade, and followed his rage to its source. However it happened, Set found the body of Osiris. And Set, who was never content with half measures, who had always been a being of extremes, cut the body of his brother into pieces. The number of pieces varies across the different tellings, some say 14, some say 42, each corresponding to a nome, a district of Egypt. The most common number in the classical accounts is 14. 14 pieces, scattered to 14 different places across the length and breadth of the land, flung to the winds and the currents and the jackals of the desert, so that the god-king who had once ruled all of Egypt would be dispersed across it, broken beyond the possibility of reunion. Or so Set believed. He had not fully reckoned with Isis. When Isis discovered what had been done, her grief became something new. Something harder. Something that had moved beyond weeping into a kind of cold and absolute determination that was more powerful than any army, more focused than any weapon. She called her sister Nephthys to her side. Nephthys, who had already abandoned her husband's cause, who had already chosen love over loyalty to violence, came without hesitation. Together, the two sisters began to search. This second search was longer than the first. It ranged across all of Egypt, up and down the Nile, through the desert and the delta, through the cities and the wilderness. They found the pieces one by one, guided, the myth tells us, by the god Anubis, the jackal-headed deity of embalming and the dead, who helped them locate each fragment and who knew, as the lord of mummification, exactly what to do with them when they were found. Anubis was himself a figure of fascinating complexity in this story. His parentage was delicate. He was, according to some tellings, the son of Osiris and Nephthys, conceived when Nephthys, who longed for a child that Set could not give her, disguised herself as Isis and lay with Osiris in the darkness. Osiris had not known it was not his wife. Nephthys had hidden the child out of shame and fear of Set's wrath. But Isis had found the child, because Isis always found what she looked for, and had raised him as her own, and Anubis had grown into one of the most important gods in all the Egyptian pantheon, the guardian of the dead, the guide of souls. Now he helped his mother and his aunt gather the broken pieces of his father by adoption, and when all the pieces had been found and reassembled, he was the one who wrapped them in linen, who performed the first embalming, who preserved the divine body against the ravages of time and separation. All but one piece were found. The 14th piece, Osiris's phallus, had been thrown into the Nile, and a fish had swallowed it, and it was gone. This is why, the ancient Egyptians said, the fish of the Nile were sacred and not to be eaten in certain circumstances. It is why the people of the cities nearest where this was said to have happened mourned this loss every year in their ritual observances. Isis fashioned a replacement of gold, and she bound the body together, and Anubis completed his work, and when it was done, Osiris was whole, not alive, not in the way of the living, but whole, and complete, and preserved, and magnificent. And Osiris passed into the underworld. He became the Lord of Duat, the realm of the dead, the place of judgment and transformation. He sat upon his throne in the Hall of Two Truths, with the scales before him and the feather of Ma'at balanced on one side, and the hearts of the dead placed on the other side to be weighed, and 42 assessors standing in attendance, and Thoth recording every judgment in his eternal ledger. Osiris was not gone. He was changed. He had passed through the mystery of death and found, on the other side, a different kind of kingship, a deeper one, perhaps a more ultimate one. The king of the living had become the king of the dead, and in Egypt, the two kingdoms were never far apart. But the living world needed a king, too. And it did not yet have one. Set sat on the throne. And Isis, hidden in the marshes, prepared to bring her son into the world. Part 4, The Birth and Childhood of Horus, the Child of Light in the Hidden Marsh. There is something deeply beautiful about the image of Isis in the marshes of Chemis, the hidden place, the secret island of Papyrus in the heart of the delta, where the world was green and wet and the sound of birds was constant and the thick reeds created a world within a world, invisible to those who did not know where to look. This was where Horus was born. His birth was quiet, as the births of those destined for great things sometimes are. There was no thunder, no divine proclamation, no golden light announcing to the world that the avenger of Osiris had arrived. There was just Isis, alone in the reed beds, and the cry of a newborn child, and the ancient river flowing around them both, indifferent and eternal. Isis named him Horus, Hor in the Egyptian, which means the distant one, the one who is high, who is far above, the way a falcon is far above, circling in the infinite blue. The falcon was his symbol, as it had been his namesake's symbol, the great Horus the Elder, who was one of the original children of the sky goddess Nut. The two Horuses were sometimes identified with each other and sometimes kept distinct. The religion of Egypt was always comfortable with such multiplicities, such layers of meaning, such understanding that one truth could be expressed in many forms without any of those forms being less true than the others. But the Horus who concerns us tonight, the Horus of this long and extraordinary story, was young, was fragile, was a child hidden in a marsh, dependent entirely on his mother's love and cleverness for his survival. Because Set knew, or suspected, or feared. The texts are not always precise about the exact content of Set's knowledge, but they are unanimous about his intentions. If Osiris had a son, that son was a threat. A living counterclaim to the throne. A divine avenger in waiting. Set sent his agents into the delta, sent demons and dark creatures to scour the marshes, to find the hidden child and end the danger before it could grow into something unstoppable. Isis was clever. She hid her son. She left him during the day, when she had to travel to beg food from nearby towns, the goddess reduced to begging, the queen in hiding, the most powerful magical being in existence asking ordinary mortals for bread and beer so that she could feed her child. This is one of the most poignant images in all of Egyptian mythology, and the Egyptians felt it deeply. They told stories of Isis traveling the dusty roads of the delta with her baby on her hip, and the people who helped her found their own children mysteriously healthy, their own crops mysteriously abundant, as though the goddess's gratitude operated on a frequency beyond the ordinary exchange of favors. But some days, Horus was sick. The marshes were dangerous places for children. The water was not always clean, the insects not always harmless, the creatures of the delta not always gentle. There were scorpions in the reeds. There were diseases carried by the air and water. And Horus, for all that he was a divine child, was also young and vulnerable and exposed. One terrible day, Isis returned to find her son lying stiff and cold in the reeds. He had been stung, by a scorpion, some say, by the general darkness of Set's curse made manifest, by the simple cruelty of the world that does not exempt even divine children from its ordinary dangers. And Isis, who had already lost her husband and spent years searching for him, who had already endured more grief than any being should have to bear, looked at her unconscious child and did something extraordinary. She screamed. She cried out to the gods, to the heavens, to the Nile itself, and her cry was so raw and so genuine and so filled with all the accumulated grief and fear and love of everything she had endured that it stopped the boat of Ra in the sky. The solar boat, that great golden vessel in which Ra traveled across the sky each day, carrying the sun from dawn to dusk, simply stopped. The sun did not move. The sky went still. The world held its breath. And from the boat, Ra sent Thoth down to earth to help. Thoth was the god of all knowledge, and he knew the cure for every poison, and he spoke the words of healing over the child Horus, and life returned to the small body lying in the papyrus. Color came back. Breath came back. The eyes opened. Isis wept with relief. The sun began to move again. These stories of Horus's childhood, there are many of them, gathered across centuries of inscription and papyrus, served an important purpose in Egyptian religious life. They were not merely mythology. They were medicine. Priests would recite the story of how Thoth healed the child Horus while treating sick children, using the narrative as a template for the healing itself. The story was the spell. The myth was the medicine. This is how Egyptian religion worked. Everything was connected to everything else, the divine and the human, the sacred and the practical, the story and its application in the living world. But Horus grew. As all children do, even children hidden in marshes, even children born of impossibility and grief, even children whose very existence was a secret and a miracle, he grew. He grew strong and fierce and quick. He learned to handle weapons. He learned the ways of the marsh, the movements of birds, the patterns of wind and water. He watched the sky with the eyes of a hawk, which is to say, with extraordinary precision, with the ability to see detail at vast distances, with a hunter's patience and a king's expectation. He asked his mother about his father. Children always do. And Isis told him everything, not softened, not diminished, but full and complete and honest. She told him about Osiris, about the feast and the chest and the Nile and Byblos. She told him about Set, about the murder and the dismemberment and the scattered pieces. She told him about the great work she and Anubis and Nephthys had done to make his father whole again. And she told him about the throne. She told him that the throne of Egypt was his by right. Not Set's, never Set's. That it had been Osiris's, and through Osiris it belonged to the son of Osiris, to Horus, to him. That Set sat upon it illegally, that every day Set occupied the throne was an offense against Ma'at, against the great cosmic principle of truth and order and justice that was the foundation of all divine and human life. The child Horus listened. And in his hawk's eyes, something hardened into purpose. He was not ready yet. Not to challenge Set directly, Set, who was one of the most powerful beings in existence, Set, who commanded storms and deserts and the raw force of chaos. No. Horus needed to grow more. Needed to become, fully, what he was destined to be. But the day was coming. In the darkness of the marsh, watched over by his mother and the ever-present memory of his father, the hawk-child sharpened himself against the edge of his grief and his determination, and waited for the moment he was ready to claim what was his. Part 5, The Great Tribunal. Horus brings his claim before the gods. The day came when Horus was grown. He was magnificent. The texts describe him as everything his father had been and something more, tall and powerful, with the head of a falcon and the eyes that could see across impossible distances, the young fighter who had been forged in hiding and grief and love into something neither his enemies nor his allies could quite believe. Isis brought him before the Ennead, the great divine council, the company of gods who governed the cosmos, and Horus stated his case. He was the son of Osiris. He was the legitimate heir to the throne of Egypt. The throne had been stolen by Set, who had murdered Osiris in violation of divine law. He demanded that the Ennead recognize his claim and restore the crown to its rightful holder. The trial that followed, which Egyptologists call the contest of Horus and Set, is one of the most extraordinary documents in all of ancient Egyptian literature. The Egyptians themselves recorded a version of it in a text known today as the Contendings of Horus and Set, written on a papyrus dating to the 20th dynasty, around 1150 BCE, though the stories themselves were far older. What makes the Contendings so remarkable is its tone. For a text dealing with the highest possible cosmic stakes, the question of who will rule the universe, the fate of truth and justice themselves, it is frequently, almost bizarrely, playful. The gods argue. They contradict each other. They get petty. They take sides and change sides. They make terrible decisions and are called out for them. Ra is at various points dismissive and grumpy. Thoth is perpetually reasonable and perpetually ignored. Neith sends a letter that makes everyone uncomfortable. It is, in the best possible way, a story about the gods behaving very much like people. Set, naturally, contested the claim. His argument was essentially this, that he was the strongest of all the gods, that he was the one who stood at the prow of Ra's solar boat each night in the form of a great warrior and drove back the chaos serpent Apophis with his spear, keeping the sun alive through the dangerous hours of darkness. Without Set, he argued, there was no sunrise. Without Set's strength, Ra himself would be swallowed and the world would end. Was it not right, then, that such a god should rule? It was, in its way, a compelling argument. And Ra, who was the head of the divine council, the supreme authority, seemed, to the frustration of everyone watching, to find it compelling. Ra had a complicated relationship with Horus's claim. In some versions, Ra had an obvious preference for Set, perhaps because Set's role protecting the solar boat was genuinely important, perhaps because Ra recognized in Set's raw power something he valued, or perhaps simply because Ra was old and not always entirely rational, and Set knew how to appeal to him. The trial stretched on. Days. Then months. Then years. 80 years, according to some texts. The Ennead debated and argued, with factions forming on both sides, with compromises proposed and rejected, with messengers sent to consult Osiris in the underworld, who, naturally, had very strong opinions about who should be king. Osiris's letter to the divine council, as preserved in the contendings, is one of the most remarkable passages in all Egyptian mythology. The dead king, speaking from his realm below, pointed out with devastating clarity that it was he who had provided the barley and wheat upon which even the gods sustained themselves. He pointed out that every god, however powerful, would one day pass through his hall and be judged. He implied, with the gentle but unmistakable menace of a god who controls the afterlife, that the council would be wise to consider his son's claim favorably. The gods, reading this letter, were deeply unsettled. Ra, receiving it, reportedly said that Osiris had a point. But still the decision was not made. Because between the legal arguments, between the formal sessions of the divine tribunal, the contest between Horus and Set was being fought in other ways, physical ways, magical ways, ways that defy easy categorization and that the Egyptians found both sacred and, occasionally, darkly comic. There was the matter of the boat race. Horus and Set were both instructed to build boats of stone, great stone vessels, and to race them on the Nile. Set dutifully built his boat from a mountain peak, great and imposing and very, very heavy. Horus built his from pine planks plastered with gypsum to look like stone, and when the boats were launched, Set's mountain sank immediately to the bottom of the Nile, and Horus sailed serenely past. This was not the end of it, of course. These contests were never quite as simple as they appeared. Set, furious, transformed himself into a hippopotamus, vast and dangerous, lord of the river in its most violent aspect, and attempted to capsize Horus's vessel. Horus threw harpoons at him, great bronze weapons that plunged into the water again and again. The goddess Isis joined in, throwing a harpoon herself, but it struck a divine creature rather than Set, and there were complications, and Horus grew angry with his mother for her hesitation, and the whole episode descended into the kind of divine family argument that makes mythology feel astonishingly real. There were other contests. There were battles on land and in the water. There was a particularly strange episode in which Set and Horus competed in what is delicately described in the texts as a test of dominance, and the implications of this contest occupied Egyptologists for quite some time after the Contendings papyrus was first translated, because the Egyptians were remarkably frank about certain aspects of the divine conflicts that later cultures might have found uncomfortable to record. The short version of this episode, for we are in polite company, and also the actual story is both complicated and somewhat unsettling, is that Set attempted to assert dominance over Horus in a way that would, in the symbolic language of Egyptian culture, have marked Horus as subordinate. But Horus, guided by Isis, turned the episode to his own advantage with a cleverness that would have impressed even Thoth. The judges, when the evidence was presented before them, found in favor of Horus, though Ra was reportedly more uncomfortable about the whole affair than almost anything else in the trial. Through all of this, the debates, the contests, the divine politics, the 80 years of deliberation, the Ennead remained divided. And Horus remained claimant, not king. But the scales were tipping. And the great battles, the real battles, the ones fought with divine weapons and cosmic stakes, were still to come. Part 6: The Wars of Horus and Set, Battles Across the Face of Egypt. The legal contest and the physical combat were always intertwined in this mythology, inseparable from each other in the way that law and force are never quite separable in any political story. While the Ennead argued in the divine hall, Horus and Set were also fighting in the world, great battles that shook the earth and changed the very shape of the land. The texts of Egypt, the pyramid texts, the coffin texts, the Book of the Dead, the dramatic ritual texts preserved at the Temple of Edfu, preserve fragments of these battles, different episodes from different eras and different theological traditions, and taken together they describe a war of staggering scope. Horus had followers. He was not alone. The followers of Horus, the Mesniu, sometimes called the blacksmiths of Horus, depicted in some texts as warriors with weapons of meteoric iron, fought alongside their lord in these battles. They were his army, his divine corps, the force he commanded in the physical contest for Egypt. Set had his own followers. The forces of chaos, the creatures of the Red Desert, the beings that belonged to the wild and uncontrolled places of the world. They were not weak, and they were not few. The most detailed account of these battles is preserved in the great temple of Horus at Edfu, a magnificent structure in Upper Egypt that still stands today, one of the best preserved temples in all the country, its walls covered from floor to ceiling with hieroglyphic inscriptions recording the triumph of Horus in extraordinary detail. The Edfu texts describe a series of battles spread across multiple episodes, beginning in the region of Nubia, in the far south, and moving northward down the length of Egypt, as though the war was a great sweeping campaign, not a single engagement but a prolonged struggle for the land itself, territory by territory, bend by bend of the Nile. In the first great battle, Horus flew against Set in his form as a solar hawk, Horus the Badite, the winged disk of the sun, blazing with golden fire, the embodiment of radiant divine power. Set appeared before him as a vast hippopotamus, or in other versions as a serpent, as a crocodile, as whatever form of primordial chaos seemed most threatening, and the battle between them was not merely between two gods but between two principles. Light and dark. Order and chaos. The right of inheritance and the power of usurpation. These were not abstract concepts in the divine battles, they were forces that manifested in sound and fury and the shaking of the earth. The great solar disk flared as Horus charged. The light was blinding, incandescent, the pure concentrated energy of justice made physical. Set's forces, the creatures of the dark water, the things that lived in the red desert, the enemies of the solar order, scattered before it or were burned. But Set himself did not fall easily. He never fell easily. This was part of Set's terrible fascination. He was genuinely, formidably powerful. He was the god who held chaos at bay in the darkness of the underworld. He was not a pretender, not a weakling who had stolen what he could never have earned. He was magnificent in his violence, extraordinary in his destructive force, and he made Horus earn every inch of ground. There is a story of one particular battle that the Edfu texts describe with great vividness. Horus rode in his winged disk form high above the battle, surveying the chaos below, and he hurled his great harpoon down at Set in the water. The weapon flew true, struck. And yet Set transformed, slipped away, took another form. And Horus descended, and there was close combat then, God against God, will against will, as fundamental and as terrible as anything the universe had ever produced. In these close battles, wounds were exchanged. The most famous wound in all this mythology is the Eye of Horus. Set reached into the battle and tore out Horus's left eye. The accounts differ on the exact circumstances. Some say it was during one of the formal physical contests of the tribunal, some say it was during one of the open battles, some say Set simply found an opportunity and seized it with the brutal directness that was his nature. But the result was the same: Horus lost his eye, and the cosmos shook with the loss of it. Because the Eye of Horus was not merely an organ. It was a symbol of immense cosmic power. The eye, called the Wedjat, the eye of truth, was a symbol of wholeness, of the full and perfect expression of divine power. To lose it was to lose a part of the order that Horus was meant to embody. The moon grew dark when Horus lost his eye. Some tellings specifically identify the left eye of Horus with the moon, while his right eye is the sun, and the darkness that fell was not merely physical but spiritual. Set took the eye and hid it, or damaged it, or broke it into pieces. The exact fate of the stolen eye varies across the texts. What is consistent is that it was gone, and its absence was a wound in the fabric of reality. But Horus was not destroyed by this loss. He continued to fight. And he was not without allies. Thoth, whose wisdom and magic were the most refined in all the divine assembly, found the fragments of the eye and reassembled them. He healed the wound. He restored the Wedjat to wholeness, and this act of restoration was itself deeply significant, because the Wedjat eye as a symbol of healing and restoration became one of the most important protective symbols in all of Egyptian culture. You will find it painted on coffins, carved on amulets, worn around the necks of the dead and the living alike for 3,000 years, precisely because it carried the meaning of this mythological event. What has been broken can be made whole. What has been lost can be found. What has been taken can be returned. The healed eye was given back to Horus. But something happened next that no one quite expected. Horus took the restored eye, and instead of keeping it for himself, he brought it to his father. In the underworld, in the hall where Osiris sat upon his throne of judgment, the son gave his father the most precious thing he possessed. He offered the Wedjat, the eye of power and wholeness, to Osiris, and Osiris received it, And in some tellings this is what sustained the dead king through the long ages of his reign below the earth. The offering of the eye became a central act of Egyptian religious ritual, repeated in temples across the country for thousands of years, the priest holding up the divine offering, making the gesture of giving to the god, repeating in symbolic form the moment when a son's love for his father expressed itself in the purest possible way. The battles continued. Up and down the Nile they raged, from the cataract lands of Nubia to the reed-choked delta. At some locations, Horus won decisively and Set retreated. At others, Set's forces surged forward and Horus was driven back. The war had no quick resolution, no decisive final engagement that ended everything in a single day. Instead, it was a grinding, terrible, exhausting campaign that stretched across years and decades, as the divine tribunal continued its deliberations and the physical conflict played out across the face of the land. And through it all, Isis was present. Not always visible, not always acting, but always there, the intelligence behind her son's campaign, the magical force supporting his efforts, the love that would not let him falter. Part 7: Isis and the Magic, the Spells that Shaped the World. We must speak more fully of Isis, because the story of Horus and Set is also, in its deepest form, the story of Isis. She is the heart of this mythology, the force from which everything else radiates, the mother and the goddess and the sorceress whose actions make every other action possible. Isis was old when the world was young. The myths do not quite say this directly. How could they, when she was born in the 5 intercalary days? But they imply it. She carries a quality of absolute ancientness, of knowledge that goes all the way down, of wisdom that is not learned but simply known, the way water knows to flow downhill. Her primary domain was magic, Heka, the Egyptians called it. Not stage magic, not illusion, but the real force of creation, the energy that existed beneath the visible world, the power to speak things into being, to change the names of things and therefore change their nature, to know the secret identity of something and therefore have complete power over it. The greatest example of Isis's magic, and one of the most quietly astonishing stories in all of Egyptian mythology, is the story of how she discovered the secret name of Ra. Ra was old. Perhaps the oldest of all beings, older even than his own mythology suggested, a divine principle so ancient and so powerful that his secret name, the name that contained his true essence, the word that was the god himself in linguistic form, was the most powerful thing in existence. Whoever knew that name would command Ra himself. Would have, in theory, absolute authority over the supreme god. Isis wanted that name. Not out of ambition, or not exactly. She wanted it because she understood that in the long campaign to restore her son to the throne, there might come a moment when she needed the authority of Ra himself, and she intended to be prepared. She waited until Ra was very old, moving slowly through the sky, drool falling from his ancient lips, and she gathered that drool from the earth where it fell, because the saliva of the divine carried something of the divine's essence. She mixed it with earth and formed from it a serpent, a creature made from Ra's own substance, which she placed in his path. The serpent bit him. The venom of a creature made from Ra's own essence was the only venom that could truly affect him, and it burned through the old god like fire, and he cried out in pain, and the other gods came running, but none of them could heal what had been done. Isis came forward. She expressed enormous compassion, great concern, the fullest possible performance of a healer ready to help. She told Ra that she could cure him, but that to speak the words of healing, she needed to know his true name. Ra tried to satisfy her with lesser names. He listed his titles: the Horizon Walker, the Shining One, Khepri in the morning and Adam in the evening and Ra at noon. He gave her names that sounded important but were not the name, and Isis listened to each one with perfect patience and said, each time, that she needed his true name. At last, in agony and with no other choice, Ra agreed. He drew his name from within himself. The texts say he let it pass from his breast to Isis, and she took it into herself, into the deepest place of her being, and then she spoke the words of healing, and the venom fled, and Ra was whole again. But Isis kept the name. She locked it away inside herself, and she passed it to Horus, her son, so that when the moment came, when the tribunal had exhausted every argument and some final authority was needed, the name could be used. This was Isis thinking 10 steps ahead, providing for her son not just in the present but in the future she could already see unfolding. Isis's magic was also present in the great battles. When Horus found himself in difficulty, when Set's forces pressed too hard, it was often Isis who intervened, not directly, because the divine rules of the contest sometimes prevented direct intervention, but cleverly, finding the angle that the rules did not explicitly exclude. There is a story of Horus striking his own mother in a moment of rage, an episode that disturbs modern readers and disturbed ancient ones too, and which is presented in the contendings not as heroic but as something Horus himself would have to account for, a moment of the war's madness that left a stain on even the righteous combatant. Horus had grown frustrated with Isis's occasional moments of mercy towards Set, her hesitation, her complexity of feeling toward her brother-in-law, the way her emotions were genuinely tangled by the long history of these divine families. In a rage, he struck her, and the blow was serious enough that certain gods stripped him of his crown as punishment. The story does not present this as acceptable. It presents it as one of the costs of war, one of the ways that prolonged conflict degrades even the most righteous warrior. Horus was the right king, of this the mythology is certain. But righteousness does not exempt anyone from moral failure, and the blow against Isis was presented as exactly that, a failure, a wound in the story of the campaign that Horus would carry. Isis herself, characteristically, did not hold it against him. She understood his frustration. She continued to support him. This, perhaps, is one of the most human things about her, her capacity to love through imperfection, to see the whole person rather than only the worst moment. She continued her work. She is recorded in various texts as working spells against Set's allies, protecting her son from poison and attack, maintaining the network of support and intelligence that kept Horus viable through the long years of the war. She was the infrastructure of the campaign, invisible, essential, without whom everything else would have collapsed. The Egyptians understood this. They loved Isis with a devotion that grew over time rather than diminishing, spreading eventually across the entire ancient world. By the Greco-Roman period, the cult of Isis had expanded far beyond Egypt. She was worshipped in Rome, in Greece, in Britain, across the breadth of the Mediterranean world. Temples to Isis stood in cities that had never heard of Osiris. People who did not know the Nile came to Isis for the same things Egyptians had always come to her for: healing, wisdom, protection, love. Because Isis was not merely a character in a myth. She was a way of understanding something true about the world. She was the idea that love is more powerful than death. that intelligence is more powerful than force. That a mother's care can hold together a cosmos that every other force is trying to pull apart. These are ideas that resonate in every culture, in every century, and it is no wonder that people across the ancient world recognized in her something they needed, something they already knew in their bones to be true. Part 8, The Weighing of the Scales, Maat and the Divine Law. Underlying everything in this great conflict, the murder, the trial, the battles, the divine scheming, was a concept that the Egyptians regarded as the most fundamental truth in existence. It was called Ma'at. Ma'at is often translated as truth or justice or order, but none of these translations fully captures it, because Ma'at was all of these things simultaneously, and it was also something more, the principle that made all of these things possible. It was the cosmic order itself. The way things were supposed to be. The right arrangement of the universe, the proper relationship between all its parts. Ma'at was also a goddess, a slender woman wearing a single white ostrich feather on her head, sometimes simply represented by the feather alone. She was the daughter of Ra, which made her a kind of divine principle made personal, and she was present at every moment of judgment, physical and cosmic. When Osiris sat in his hall and judged the dead, it was Ma'at's feather that was placed on one side of the scales. The heart of the deceased, the seat of consciousness and moral life, was placed on the other side. If the heart was heavier than the feather, if it was burdened by wrongdoing and dishonesty and cruelty, it would be devoured by the Ammit, the great composite monster waiting beside the scales, and the soul would cease to exist. But if the heart was light as the feather, or lighter, if it was unencumbered by wrong, if it could truthfully make the 42 declarations of innocence before the 42 assessors of the dead, then the soul passed onward into the field of reeds, the paradise beyond death, where the wheat grew tall and the river flowed cool and clear and the dead lived in abundance for eternity. In the context of the contest between Horus and Set, Ma'at was not merely a background concept. She was the reason the trial existed at all. She was why Horus had a claim. She was why Set's murder of Osiris was not simply unfortunate but cosmically wrong, a violation of the deepest law of existence. Osiris had been the first great practitioner of Ma'at among the divine kings. His reign had been characterized by justice and truth and the proper ordering of divine and human society. He had built Ma'at into the foundation of his kingship, and in doing so he had made Ma'at inseparable from the concept of legitimate rule. Set's reign, by contrast, was built on a lie. On a murder. On the forcible taking of what was not his. It was, by definition, a reign contrary to Ma'at, a reign that could not be legitimate no matter how long it lasted or how forcefully Set enforced it, because legitimacy in Egypt was not merely about power. Power without truth was tyranny. Force without justice was simply violence. A king who ruled against Ma'at was not a king at all, regardless of the crown he wore. This is why the trial of Horus and Set was not merely a legal proceeding or a political contest. It was a cosmic question. It was the universe asking itself, through the medium of the divine council, what is the right order of things? Who belongs where? What does truth require? The Ennead, in their long deliberation, were not just referees in a dispute. They were the universe's faculty of reason, working through the hardest question the cosmos had yet produced. And their slowness, their arguments, their changes of mind, all of this, as frustrating as it is to read about, was the process of that reasoning, the grinding work of trying to understand what Ma'at actually required in a situation of unprecedented complexity. Because the situation was genuinely complex, even beyond the obvious injustice of Set's crime. Set was not useless. Set had a role to play in the divine order, the protection of Ra's boat, the management of the desert and its forces, the preservation of the wild places that needed a lord. If Horus took the throne and Set was simply cast aside, who would fight Apophis in the darkness? Who would stand at the prow of the solar boat each night, armed with his spear, driving back the chaos that would otherwise swallow the sun? The divine order needed Set somewhere. The question was where, and in what relation to Horus. This is one of the deep wisdoms of Egyptian mythology. It did not ultimately present the universe as a simple conflict between good and evil where good triumphs and evil is destroyed. It presented it as a more nuanced negotiation, an understanding that even the most dangerous forces have their place, that the complete elimination of chaos is neither possible nor desirable, that what is needed is not the destruction of Set but the proper ordering of Set, his placement in a role where his power can be used without his destructiveness being turned against the things that matter. The resolution they would eventually reach would try to honor this understanding. But before they reached it, the contest still had battles to fight. And Horus had one more wound to receive, and one more miraculous restoration to experience, before the end. Part 9, The Second Eye and the Mysteries of Transformation. There are episodes in the mythology of Horus and Set that open like doors into deep rooms, rooms filled with things that are harder to see clearly, things that require patience and slow movement to approach. This is one of those episodes. After the restoration of his eye by Thoth, after the battles that raged across the body of Egypt, Horus came to a place in the contest where he needed to understand something that no amount of fighting could teach him. He needed to understand death. Not death as an abstract concept, he had grown up in its shadow. He had been born from a father who had died and been partially restored and had died again in a different way, a divine death into the underworld. He understood the fact of death, the proximity of it. What he needed to understand was its interior, what lay on the other side, what his father's existence there was truly like, what the kingdom of the dead actually meant. And so, in some versions of the mythology, Horus descended. Like all the great heroes who descend to the underworld, like Orpheus, like Gilgamesh, like Aeneas, like all the others who have made that terrible and necessary journey, Horus went down into the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, to see his father. The Duat was not a simple place. It was vast and strange and filled with obstacles, 12 gates to pass through, each guarded by a serpent with fire in its mouth, each requiring the knowledge of specific divine words and names to open. There were halls and caverns and rivers of darkness, and the souls of the dead moved through them in their millions, and the light was different there, not the golden light of the sun but a phosphorescent glow, the light of transformation and process. Osiris sat at the center of it all, and the meeting between father and son, in those texts that preserve it, is one of the most quietly beautiful moments in all the mythology. Osiris was different. Death had changed him, deepened him, perhaps, removed from him everything that was merely surface and left only what was essential. He was green-skinned and still as the earth in winter, as the land before the flood when nothing grows and nothing moves but the river, and even the river seems to have slowed. He received his son. There were things said between them that the texts do not record in full, and this is right and fitting. There are conversations that belong to the interior of the myth, not to its exterior telling. What we know is that Horus emerged from the underworld changed. More resolved. More complete. Something of his father had entered him, some understanding, some transmission from the dead to the living. He came back carrying a different quality of light. This transformation in Horus, from the wounded, struggling heir of the earlier episodes to the fully realized divine king of the later ones, mirrors a pattern found in mystery traditions across the ancient world. The descent, the encounter with death or the dead, the return transformed. It is the pattern of initiation, of the deep change that cannot happen at the surface of life but requires going into the dark. In Egyptian religious practice, this pattern was enacted ritually. The priests of Osiris performed rites of descent and return. The deceased were guided through the Duat by the Book of the Dead and the Amduat, the detailed maps and instruction manuals for navigating the underworld. The ritual texts on the walls of royal tombs were there precisely so that the dead could perform the journey correctly, could speak the right words at the right gates, could find their way to the hall of judgment and emerge on the other side. Horus's descent was the mythological template for all of this. He was the first living being to go down and come back, and his return was not merely a personal triumph but a gift to all of humanity, a demonstration that the dark could be navigated, that the dead could be found and spoken to, that the relationship between the living and the dead was not severed but only transformed. He came back to the upper world carrying something else, too. He came back carrying a deeper understanding of Set. Because the underworld, in Egyptian thought, is the place where all disguises fall away. Where the heart is weighed against the feather and its true nature is revealed without any possibility of concealment. In that place, Horus could see Set clearly, not the brother who murdered his father, not the rival who stole the throne, not the enemy who tore out his eye, but something beneath and behind all of that. The force of chaos as it truly was, necessary, terrifying, indispensable, wrong in its current placement but not without its rightful role in the order of things. This understanding did not make Horus merciful in the battles. The battles were not over, and mercy before justice is merely weakness. But it gave Horus something that would matter enormously when the battles were done, the capacity to arrange a resolution that was not simply revenge. He came back to the world of the living. He stood before the Ennead again. And the atmosphere in the divine court had shifted. Something in the long trial had finally tipped. The 80 years of argument, the physical contests, the battles across Egypt, the letters from Osiris in the underworld, the accumulated evidence of righteousness on one side and violence on the other, all of it had slowly, inexorably, built toward a conclusion that even Ra could no longer avoid acknowledging. The gods were ready to decide. Part 10, The Final Judgment, the Ennead speaks at last. The divine assembly gathered one more time. All the great gods of the Ennead were present, and many others besides, the gods of every nome of Egypt, the divine forces of river and desert and sky, the old gods and the new gods, everyone who had any stake in the question that had hung over the cosmos for 80 years. The hall was vast and still. Not the stillness of emptiness, but the stillness of held breath, of a moment balanced at the very tip of a fulcrum, about to fall one way or another. Ra sat at the center, old and magnificent and more than a little relieved that this was finally ending. The argument had been wearing on him. The 80 years of contention had ground down even the supreme solar god, and he was ready, truly ready, for the first time, to let it conclude. Thoth rose. Thoth, the recorder of all things, the measurer of all time, the God who had given 5 days to the world so that the children of Nut could be born, Thoth, who had been on the right side of this argument since the beginning, whose patience and precision had never wavered through all the decades of deliberation. He presented the case of Horus one final time. Not dramatically. Not with the flourish of an advocate who has been waiting to deliver his speech. That was not Thoth's style. He presented it simply, clearly, with the precision of a mathematician completing a proof. The facts were the facts. Osiris had been the king. Osiris had been murdered by Set in violation of divine law. Horus was the legitimate heir of Osiris. The principle of Ma'at required that the throne be given to its rightful holder. The silence after he finished was very long. Set rose to make his final argument. And Set, who was never less than magnificent, spoke with all the force and fire of his divine nature. He spoke of his strength, his necessity, his protection of the solar boat, his role as the keeper of the desert, his power and his will and his determination. He spoke well. He had always spoken well. But the words fell differently now. After 80 years, after all the evidence, after Osiris's letter from the underworld and the physical contests and the battles and the restoration of the Wedjat-I and everything else, Set's words, however brilliant, were not enough. The gods of the Ennead voted. And they voted for Horus. Not unanimously, the divine assembly was never unanimous about anything, being composed of gods, who are incapable of unanimity by nature. But the majority was clear, and decisive, and Ra, looking at it, nodded slowly. The great crowned head of the sun god inclined in acknowledgement of a truth that had been true all along. Horus was given the white crown. He was given the crook and the flail. He was given the double throne. He was declared the legitimate king of all Egypt, the living embodiment of divine order, the falcon on the horizon who would carry the rule of his father forward into a new age. The gods around him wept with relief. Even the gods who had been uncertain, who had argued for Set or remained undecided through the long deliberation, they wept, because the resolution of a wrong is itself a kind of grace, and when justice finally arrives after a very long absence, the arrival of it is almost unbearably moving. But there was still the matter of Set. Set stood in the divine hall after the vote, and the question of what to do with him was not a small one. He was dangerous. He was furious. He was one of the most powerful beings in existence, and he had just lost everything he had spent 80 years holding on to. The potential for further violence was real and immediate. Ra, who understood Set's value better than most, rose again. Set would not be destroyed. He would not be cast out of the divine order entirely. He would not be punished in any ordinary way, because what punishment could meaningfully constrain a god of Set's magnitude? Instead, Set was given a new role. Or rather, the old role made explicit, formalized, established as his eternal function. He would stand at the prow of Ra's solar boat. Every night, when the boat of Ra descended into the Duat and traveled through the 12 hours of darkness, Set would stand at its prow with his great spear, and he would drive back Apophis, the chaos serpent, the great enemy of the solar order, the nothing that always threatened to swallow everything. Set's violence, his chaos, his terrible and indiscriminate destructive force, all of it would be aimed at the one enemy that deserved it completely, the pure negation that lay beyond even Set's own chaotic nature. This was, in its way, a profound resolution. Not a neat one. Nothing about the mythology of Horus and Set was ever neat. But a wise one. Set's power was not eliminated. It was redirected. The Chaos God was given the role of Chaos Fighter, set against the only enemy that could truly deserve his full attention. Set accepted this. Not gracefully, grace had never been Set's strong suit. But he accepted it, because Set understood power, and he understood that this was the best available outcome, and because somewhere beneath the violence and the resentment and the murderous ambition, there was still a divine being who knew his role in the cosmos, however much he had resisted it. The divine assembly dispersed. And Horus turned to face the throne of Egypt. Part 11, The Coronation of Horus, the Falcon King ascends. The coronation of Horus was not merely a political ceremony. It was a cosmic event. When Horus received the double crown, the combined red and white crown of the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt united under a single king, something settled into place in the fabric of the universe that had been slightly wrong for 80 years. The world had been had been running on a crooked axis, and now it righted itself, quietly and completely, the way a scale settles when the correct weight is placed on the correct side. The Egyptians understood this deeply. Every pharaoh who ever sat on the throne of Egypt after this mythological moment was understood to be Horus. Literally, not metaphorically. The living king was the living Horus, the falcon on the horizon, the embodiment of divine order in the human world. And when that king died, he became Osiris, joined his divine father in the underworld, took his place among the eternal dead, and was replaced by his own son, who was the new Horus. This is why the mythology of Osiris and Horus and Set was not merely a story the Egyptians told. It was the template through which they understood every succession, every transfer of power, every moment when one king's reign ended and another began. Death and resurrection. The weighing of the heart. The long journey of the son to claim what his father held. The coronation ceremony itself, as it was practiced in Egypt for 3,000 years, was an elaborate ritual enactment of the mythological events. The new king was presented with the crowns in a ceremony that echoed the moment of Horus's crowning by the Ennead. He performed rituals that enacted his identification with Horus, his reception of the divine power, his connection to both the living authority of his office and the dead ancestors who had held it before him. And then he was anointed. And then the crowns were placed. And the universe received its new Horus. But before the formal coronation, before the ceremony that would be enacted before the assembled court, Horus did something that is one of the most beautiful moments in all the mythology. He went to his father. And Osiris, in the darkness of his eternal hall, received this news. The texts do not tell us exactly what Osiris felt in that moment. That feels right. Some experiences are too large for description. But the images that surround this moment in Egyptian art and inscription are images of peace, the deeply still, completely settled quality of a thing resolved. The scales balanced. The feather level. The heart light. Horus returned to the upper world and allowed himself to be crowned. The ceremony was presided over by the gods most central to the story. Thoth was there, naturally, recording everything, ensuring that the divine words were spoken correctly, that the ritual was proper in every detail. Anubis was there, representing the connection between the living king and the dead. Hathor was there, the great goddess of love and beauty, the divine mother in her celestial form, who pressed the crowns onto Horus's head with her hands. Isis was there. She stood with Nephthys beside her, the two sisters, the grieving pair who had searched for Osiris together, who had wept over his broken body together, who had supported Horus through all the long years of the contest. They stood at the sides of the throne, as they would stand forever after in Egyptian religious imagery, Isis with her hieroglyphic throne sign on her head, Nephthys with her basket and her enclosure sign, flanking the divine dead and the divine living alike, the twin protectors, the eternal guardians. Isis looked at her son on the throne. Whatever she felt in that moment, whatever mixture of grief and triumph, of loss and vindication, of love for her dead husband and love for her living son, is perhaps beyond the capacity of any language to describe. She had carried this moment in her for 80 years. She had planned for it, worked for it, suffered for it, hidden in marshes for it, begged food for it, traveled to foreign lands for it, worked impossible magic for it. She had endured more than any being should have to endure, and she had not broken, and she had not given up, and the thing she had refused to stop believing in was now, at last, true. The falcon crown shone on her son's head. Egypt had her king. The first thing Horus did as king, even before the formal coronation feast, even before the proclamations and the rituals of assuming power, was to institute a set of divine laws in honor of his father. Laws of succession, of inheritance, of the rights of legitimate heirs. Laws against the usurpation of power. Laws that enshrined the principle that what belongs to a man's child belongs to that child, and that the killing of a king is the highest possible crime against the divine order. These laws were not merely abstract. They were the legal foundation of the Egyptian concept of legitimate rule, the divine charter from which all subsequent kingship derived its authority. Every pharaoh who later claimed the double crown was implicitly claiming it under these laws, asserting that he was Horus, that he was the legitimate heir, that his rule was in accordance with Ma'at and therefore with the will of all the gods. The country settled into celebration. The Nile, which had been strange and troubled through the long years of the contested throne, flooding unpredictably, carrying more silt than usual, its rhythms slightly off in the way of a world whose ruler is uncertain, returned to its proper patterns. The grain grew straight and tall. The birds returned to the marshes in their ancient numbers. The deserts stayed in their proper places, beyond the black land, beyond the irrigated fields, respectful of the boundary that the proper order of things required. Horus ruled. And Egypt was, for a time, as it should have always been. Part 12, The Eternal Echo, Legacy, Meaning, and the Story That Never Ends. Every myth that survives for 3,000 years survives because it is telling the truth about something. Not a factual truth, not a truth that can be verified in a laboratory or confirmed by archaeology. But a deeper truth, a truth about the structure of experience, about the patterns that recur in human lives and human societies, about the things that are always happening even when they are not literally happening. The story of Horus and Set has survived for longer than almost any other story on Earth. It was already ancient when Homer was young. It was being carved into the walls of Egyptian temples at the same time the Greeks were composing their earliest hymns to Zeus. And it is still here, still being told, still resonating, still alive in a way that suggests it has not yet finished telling us what it knows. Let us consider what it knows. It knows about loss. The loss of Osiris, sudden, violent, utterly unexpected, the dismantling of everything that seemed stable and good, is a loss that every human being has felt in one form or another. The world changes overnight. The thing you depended on is gone. The person you loved is absent. The order you took for granted has been broken, and you are standing in the ruins of it, trying to understand what to do next. The mythology does not tell you that the loss will not happen. It does not promise you that the chest will not be sealed, that the body will not be scattered. It does not offer protection against the violence of the world. What it offers is something more honest and, in the long run, more useful. It shows you Isis, gathering the pieces. It shows you the long search, the refusal to give up, the combination of grief and determination that eventually, not quickly, not easily, but eventually, assembles something from the wreckage. It knows about waiting. Horus spent years in the marshes before he was ready to claim his throne. He grew in hiding. He was sick. He was stung by scorpions. He was protected and loved, but he was also hidden, delayed, dependent on others, unable yet to be what he would become. And then, when he was ready, when he emerged and made his claim and went before the Ennead, the trial itself lasted 80 more years. 80 years. This is the mythology's most difficult truth, and perhaps its most important one. Justice is slow. The right resolution of a great wrong does not arrive quickly. The universe does not hasten to make things right. It deliberates. It argues. It changes its mind and changes it back again. It is susceptible to the influence of the powerful and resistant to the straightforward claims of the deserving. And through all of that, through all the frustration and the delay and the seemingly interminable process, the person with the legitimate claim has to keep showing up. Has to keep making the argument. Has to keep fighting the battles and taking the wounds and getting back up again. The mythology does not apologize for this slowness. It presents it honestly, even with a certain dark humor. The divine council's deliberations in the contendings are genuinely funny in places, the gods behaving with the petty irrationality of any committee asked to make a decision it would rather avoid. But the humor does not diminish the seriousness. It acknowledges the difficulty without pretending the difficulty isn't real. And it promises, not through sentimental assurance but through the hard evidence of the story itself, that the waiting ends. That the 80 years finish. That the vote is finally taken, and it goes the right way. It knows about transformation. Osiris dies, and his death is not a simple end. It is the beginning of his deepest role. He becomes the Lord of the dead, the judge of all souls, the king of the place that all living things must eventually visit. His death is not defeat. It is translation, a change from one form of power to another, from the visible and temporary to the invisible and eternal. This idea, that death is transformation, not annihilation, was the cornerstone of Egyptian civilization. It shaped everything, the great pyramids and the elaborate tombs, the mummification and the amulets and the spells, the long tradition of preparing the dead with everything they might need for the life that would follow death. The Egyptians were not death-obsessed in the morbid way that later cultures sometimes imagined. They were life-affirmers who understood that life did not end at the grave but continued in a different form, and they wanted that form to be as good as possible. And the mythological template for this understanding was Osiris. His death and his resurrection, partial, strange, not a return to ordinary life but a transformation into something deeper, was the story that all Egyptians understood themselves to be living. We are all Osiris. We are all, eventually, going to lie down in our own chests and float out into the darkness, and the question is whether we have done enough good, whether our hearts are light enough, whether the love of those who survive us will gather our scattered pieces and make us whole for what comes next. It knows about Set. This is perhaps the most subtle and most important thing the mythology knows, and it is worth dwelling on. Set is not destroyed. Set is not simply defeated and eliminated. He is given a role. Set fighting Apophis is one of the great images of Egyptian religious thought. The chaos god, the murderer, the violent and uncontrollable force, standing at the prow of the sun's boat in the darkness, protecting the source of all light and life against the one enemy that truly threatens it. The violence aimed at the void. The chaos deployed against pure negation. This is the resolution the Egyptians found to the problem of destructive force, and it is a resolution worth thinking about. Not elimination. Not imprisonment. Not simple punishment. But redirection, the transformation of a destructive power into a protective one, without pretending that the power itself has changed its nature. It knows about mothers. The figure of Isis resonates across cultures and centuries with a power that feels inexhaustible. She is the mother who does not give up. The wife whose love outlasts death. The goddess whose intelligence and patience and fierce determination make possible everything else. Without her, Horus is not born. Without her, the pieces of Osiris are not gathered. Without her magic, there is no restoration, no trial, no coronation, no justice. She is the connective tissue of the whole mythology, the force that holds everything together, and the Egyptians knew it. Their devotion to Isis was not merely theological. It was personal, intimate, a relationship with a divine presence who they understood to care about them in the specific, particular way that mothers care, not abstractly, not from a distance, but close, hands-on, willing to travel to foreign cities and nurse children at foreign courts and beg bread from strangers and work magic in the dark. The image of Isis nursing her son Horus, the seated goddess with the infant at her breast, crowned and queenly and utterly focused on the child she holds, became one of the most reproduced images in the ancient world. It passed into Christian iconography as the image of the Madonna and Child, and if you look at the two images side by side, the resemblance is not accidental. The archetype of the Divine Mother and the Divine Child is the same archetype, expressing itself in different theologies, carrying the same fundamental truth. Love survives. Love protects. Love, applied with intelligence and patience and unbreakable determination, can do what nothing else can do. This is what Isis shows us. This is what she has always shown us. The mythology of Horus and Set spread across the ancient world as Egypt's influence grew. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, he did not attempt to replace Egyptian religion with Greek religion. He came to the temple of Ammonius at Siwa and asked to be recognized as the son of the god, as Horus, in effect. He understood that the mythology of divine kingship was older and deeper than his own, and that to rule Egypt, one had to be willing to be absorbed into its story. His successors, the Ptolemaic dynasty, went further. They fused Greek and Egyptian religious concepts into something new, something that expressed both traditions while betraying neither. Zeus Ammonius. Dionysus Osiris. Isis remained largely herself, because Isis is always largely herself, too complete, too perfectly defined, too essentially coherent to be meaningfully diluted by addition. The Romans came, and Egypt became a province of the empire, and still the temples were maintained and the priests continued their ancient rites and the mythology lived on in the daily lives of the people. The festival of Osiris was celebrated every year in the month of Khoiak, when the Nile receded and the planting began, when the farmers put seed into the earth that was the body of Osiris and waited for what would grow. They knew the story. It was the story of the seed, buried in the dark, transformed in the dark, emerging as something green and alive. The myth and the agricultural cycle were the same story told in different media. When Christianity came to Egypt, it did not erase the old stories immediately or completely. The Coptic Christians of Egypt preserved many elements of the older religion in their new faith, sometimes consciously, sometimes through the simple inertia of deep cultural memory. The 40 days of Lent echo the 42 days of Osiris's decomposition in some traditions. The resurrection of Christ found resonance in a culture that had been telling stories of divine death and return for 3,000 years. Not because one story caused the other, but because both stories were drawing from the same deep well of human need, the need to believe that death is not the end, that love can outlast separation, that what has been broken can be made whole. Today, the mythology of Horus and Set is studied by scholars across the world. The hieroglyphs that recorded have been translated into dozens of languages. The temples that preserve the most detailed accounts, the Temple of Horus at Edfu, the Temple of Osiris at Abydos, the Great Complex at Karnak, the temples of Isis at Philae, still stand, still draw pilgrims and visitors, still radiate the presence of something ancient and alive in the way that only the truly sacred can. The Eye of Horus, the Wedjet, appears on jewelry and tattoos and artwork across the contemporary world, often worn by people who may not know its exact mythological origin but who sense, correctly, that it carries a meaning about wholeness and protection and the restoration of what has been broken. Horus himself gave his name to the horizon. The Egyptians called the place where the sun rises and sets the Ake, and Horus of the horizon, Hormukit, was the divine principle of the transition between states, the god of thresholds, of the point where one thing becomes another. The Sphinx at Giza, that great limestone figure crouching in the desert, was identified in the New Kingdom as Hormukit, Horus in the horizon, the falcon god looking east toward the rising sun, watching for the dawn across all the ages of the world. The Sphinx has been watching for 4,500 years. The sun has not failed to rise yet. Every morning is a new coronation of Horus. Every sunrise is Ra's boat emerging from the eastern horizon, Set having successfully defended it through the hours of darkness, the chaos held back for another day. Every year the Nile floods and recedes and the black soil is left behind and the grain grows and the people eat, Osiris, giving himself to the earth so that life can continue. These are not dead stories. They were never dead stories. They are the living mythology of a living world, and the fact that the names of the gods are ancient and the language of the rituals is no longer spoken does not change the fact that what they describe is still happening, right now, every day, in the cycle of seasons and the movement of rivers and the very particular way that love refuses to admit the finality of death. Horus rules. Not as a historical figure, not as the king of a Bronze Age civilization, but as the principle he was always meant to represent, the just order, the proper arrangement of things, the truth that eventually overcomes the lie, the heir who eventually claims the throne. The throne is always being contested. The story is always in progress. Set is always finding new ways to make his arguments, and Isis is always gathering the scattered pieces, and Horus is always growing in the hidden marshes, preparing for the day when he will be ready. And Osiris waits in his eternal hall, with the scales before him and the feather of Ma'at balanced on one side, patient as only the dead can truly be patient, knowing that every soul will come to him eventually, and that when they do, the only question that will matter is the weight of what they carried in their lives. Was it light? Was it honest? Was it full of the particular quality of love that Isis showed us, the love that keeps looking for what is lost, that keeps assembling what has been scattered, that does not give up even when the evidence for giving up is overwhelming? Was it, in the end, lighter than a feather? These are not questions the mythology answers for you. It cannot answer them. Only you can answer them, with the way you choose to live the days that are still yours to live. The story of Horus and Set is 3,000 years old, and it is also happening right now. It is as old as injustice, and as persistent as hope. It is the oldest story still being told. Closing meditation. Let the story settle around you now, like warm linen, like the soft earth of the Nile Valley after the flood has receded and the land is rich and still. The gods have taken their places. The throne is occupied by the rightful king. The great falcon looks out from the horizon with his golden eyes, watching the sun climb into the morning sky. You are here, in this quiet moment, held between the ancient world and the world of your own breathing. Let your body be heavy. Let your thoughts slow and soften and drift like papyrus boats on a very still river, moving gently, without destination, simply moving. You have traveled far tonight. You have been to the beginning of the world, to the feasts of gods and the secrets of marshes, to the halls of divine judgment and the darkness below the earth. You have watched a son grow into a king, and a mother refuse to stop loving, and a father wait in the patient dark for justice to arrive. All of that is still with you. It will still be with you when you wake. But right now, there is only this. The warmth of the place where you rest. The slow movement of your breath. The way the world beyond this moment is very, very far away. Osiris holds the scales in the deep dark, and they are balanced tonight. Isis watches over the sleeping world with her great wings spread wide, the way she spread them over the body of her husband, the way she will always spread them over everyone who needs protecting. And Horus, the falcon, the distant one, the high one, he circles somewhere above you now, patient and serene, watching over the horizon with those eyes that can see farther than any living thing. You are held. You are watched over. You are safe in the ancient story, wrapped in 3,000 years of telling, carried by the same river that carried Osiris to his strange and necessary rest. Let your eyes be still behind their lids. Let the stars of Nut's great body move slowly overhead. Let the night be long and deep and full of the particular peace that comes from knowing that even the hardest stories end in the right place. Sleep now. The Nile is flowing. The sun will rise again in the morning. Sleep. If you're still awake, just breathe slowly and let the ancient stories drift with you. Subscribe to Mythology for sleep for a new legend every week. Sweet dreams.